So my name's John Morgan. The story I'm going to tell you about is about a business that I ran, and a startup business called Gracelink. But I guess to sort of set the scene to some extent, I'll talk a bit about how I ended up being in a position of, I guess, having the opportunity to run a startup business. I was trained as a farm advisor through my undergraduate degree, and then got seduced by the big money of the IT sector and never worked in the agricultural sector at all. Initially with IBM, and then made a relocation out of New Zealand into Australia, and ranged from selling PCs, which was an interesting focal experience about sales and how to make money, right through to then working in an Australian company that had developed EFTPOS technology and was selling it internationally. And I got taken on as an international salesperson for that, which again was one of those really interesting experiences, because a medium-sized company doesn't really know the same things that big companies do. So I got taken on as what I thought was a sales role, but what was actually really a marketing role. And by that I mean they thought they had products and services that you could sell into another market, but they didn't. They actually had some technology that had some relevance to that market, but they had to do product developments and adjustments. So I spent a rather frustrating first 12 months trying to sell something, and then really had to go back into, well, what do we need to do to actually have anyone buy it? And that was a really interesting thing. A lot of travelling. That company then went through a lot of change. It was an Australian ASX listed company. It grew. It then contracted a bit, and then it grew again. It developed an aspiration just prior to the tech wreck to relist itself on NASDAQ, and I ended up being sort of heavily involved in a process of where the owner was really trying to organise or orchestrate the process of really getting the company taken off the ASX and relisted on NASDAQ, and that involved some fairly high-powered American organisations, including JP Morgan and McKinsey, and that was fascinating. The aspiration was great, the execution wasn't perhaps quite so good, I think, and then the tech wreck happened, so it all really turned to custard. As the company got itself increasingly into trouble, I was perhaps in more junior roles, and I got the opportunity to do more and more senior things, and ultimately ended up doing a range of things, including replacing and restructuring a Belgian business that we'd purchased, negotiating and securing new capital to bring into the business. When we started off the process, we were trying to raise capital at $1. In the end, we raised it at 8 cents. So you can imagine the dilution involved in that. Completely changed from a minor shareholder to a majority shareholder owning the business, and at that time I left that company. But certainly that experience, perhaps the adversity, you've got to dig deep, you've got to think hard, you've got to execute and get things done, really is really useful knowledge. So came back to New Zealand, and after a period at Otago University where I was Director of Research and Enterprise, I got an opportunity to join what was Crop and Food Research here in Christchurch, and they had one particular problem that they were looking for someone to solve, and that was to really take a hand in a startup business which they had invested a lot of capital in, but really didn't have much of a direction. And that business was called Gracelink, and it was formed around a family of patents to do with extracting out of barley grain a functional food ingredient called glucogel. Barley grain is quite high in beta-glucan, and beta-glucan as a material has a reputation of being good in your body. It helps absorb cholesterol, it's a soluble fibre, so it's good for your gut health. So it's sort of one of these functional food or health-giving property ingredients. And so they had developed this patent which involved the process of extracting that functional ingredient from the cereal itself, and they were trying to commercialise that patent. The outcome they were really seeking was to license it. find someone who was enthusiastic about it and would actually just go ahead and they could just collect a royalty. They had found that that was incredibly difficult, and I think there's a number of reasons for that. One of them was probably a bit of a technology ahead of its time. There wasn't really an established market for that type of ingredient, and therefore the food companies that perhaps had some interest didn't really see where it fitted into their plans. So they were reluctant, and so Crop and Food quite courageously made a decision to invest some of their own capital in proving that it was a valuable food ingredient, and to that end they put together a small-scale pilot manufacturing facility in a tiny little corner of the old Islington Meatworks. It's quite a weird experience really, because you walk through this was a meatworks that probably employed 5,000 people, and tucked into this corner of this huge cavernous building was this little manufacturing plant. I mean, which was, the site was fit for purpose in some ways, because it had waste discharges, it had all the power, it had steam, it had ammonia for freezing and thawing, which was a significant part of the process, and then it had this little pilot plant. So Crop and Food to that point had invested several $1 million in assembling this pilot plant, and really then were a bit caught, and I think it's fair to say that the owner of this technology was caught in this bind for almost all of the time that I was involved. So this is 2005, I took over as chief executive of that startup, and really started to try and find how to demonstrate to a exit partner the value of the technology. So the vision was always to sell it somewhere, ideally as soon as inexpensively as possible. What that happened was it proved to be rather a difficult thing to do. For the reasons I mentioned before, the market wasn't really established for that type of ingredient. So we not only had to work out how the production system looked, and that means taking a laboratory process and actually turning it into a manufacturing process. So there's a whole technical journey. Characterising the resultant material, what is it? Producing it consistently so that someone could see that it has some value. And then we ended up appointing a distributor, becoming a small manufacturer, and actually selling the product internationally. And that was really a hell of a journey. So I guess the question is, you get trained in a certain area, and how do you actually move to doing lots of different things, which I have over time. I was trained to be a farm advisor, and I never have ever been a farm advisor. I guess what you learn through, I took a job which looked interesting, and that job was, as it turned out, also a very useful training ground. IBM had a particular way of training their people, and a particular type of people perhaps that they train, but a particular way of training people. So they taught you about sales and marketing, they taught you about working with customers. They did then later on teach you a bit about management, although I wasn't there perhaps long enough to really get into management in IBM. But certainly that focus on the customer, that really trying to understand their needs, that real focus on trying to figure out how to deliver a solution excuse me, that met their needs, was a really important training system, grounding system. And then when I went over to Australia and then got into this medium-sized IT company, I guess that was really where I started selling things, because I knew how to do that. But it really evolved from there into managing a small team and then learning how to do that. It then moved into, I guess, the strategic positioning of that team. What are we trying to achieve here? How do we go about it? Let's get on with it. How do you measure it? Let's make it happen, which is really strategy and management and application of it. I guess it was still the IT industry. I did have some understanding of the products and the services, but a lot of the stuff you learn as you do. You can't know everything. And mostly when you move into these areas, there are people who do, and they'll always know far more than you. So these highly technical people are. So I guess my skills have always been more as an enabler, and perhaps identifying that sort of where the opportunity might be, and then having a crack at going after the opportunity. But I think I'm also a great believer in the old emergent strategy area. You have you make some deliberate steps towards something, but then you listen really carefully, and then you try and adapt what you need to do that. And by adapt, I mean it's you, but it's also the resources that are around you, or maybe the resources that have been entrusted to you, and that's a lot of fun. It's really interesting, and it's really challenging, and it really goes exactly the way you're expecting. But that's where the emergent thing comes in, and particularly with startup ventures and with careers, I think, which are startup ventures too. You've got to be both open to what you intend to do, but also what you learn about yourself. What do you like? What don't you like? How do you get on with people? Are you good at some things? Are you not so good at other things? And then you sort of gradually sort of swim a bit like a fish down not so much the path of least resistance, because I don't think that's the right way to put it. I think it's really the areas that really get you going, get you enthusiastic, that you find sort of challenging, and that's really very much what's happened with me. I guess it's been opportunistic. It hasn't been totally mapped. Part of the reason why you've got to be opportunistic too is I've had a partner who's had a career path, and you've got to adapt your own circumstances to that situation. You can't just pursue, I'm going to be CEO of Telecom or something like that, because things happen, and you need to I guess, adapt to those circumstances. So GraceLink, we've got to get to a point where we've got a product, we're taking it to the markets, we've signed up distributors. We don't actually really know where the value proposition, to use that term, for this ingredient is. I still remember when I first came, I asked other people who'd been associated, what is the unique selling proposition here? And they said, well, it's this, this, and this. And I said, no, those are differences. They're not selling propositions. Selling propositions are things that people actually value. So I think to some extent the journey that we went on was to try and find out what the selling proposition is. And like many of these things, it often boils back to particular events and people that are around those events. In the case of this particular situation, we appointed this huge multinational distributor called DKSH, but it all boiled down to a young Italian guy by the name of Marco Caspani, who got it. For whatever reason, he could see that there was an opportunity. When you sort of dug into why, after talking to him about it over time, what it came back to was, at the time he had made his sales quota with other ingredients for the year, and he was looking for a new ingredient that might be his sales quota the year after that and the year after that. So quite visionary, quite a long, he was thinking ahead, which was fantastic, but he was also, he had a bit of a biochemistry background. He sort of saw that this was perhaps a really good opportunity, and he then, at that stage, we were sort of a step removed. There was another intermediary involved, and Marco introduced the glucogel product to a big Italian company called Barilla, and they were quite enthusiastic about it because they were trying to introduce a line of functional food products, and what they could see was that this ingredient could enable them to boost the healthiness of that product by addition without really changing recipes. So that became almost the selling proposition, was that they didn't have to change everything. They could actually just make this. We didn't know that. We learnt that through the customers interacting with that, and with someone like Marco going out and saying, hey, we've got this great thing, and then people saying, well, yeah, whatever. So we had this big customer who then, once they got interested, qualified us, and that was a very interesting process. They first of all got us to give a bid to deliver. I think the first order was something in the order of, can you deliver 30 tonnes of this ingredient? By this stage, we'd made maybe about 700 kilos all up, or something like that order. The first challenge was, okay, we need another 100 kilos to trial. So we scurried around and we worked long hours, and we produced 100 kilos and we shipped it over, and they were quite happy with that, and it went into their trials, and they did a small scale trial in stores. And then the next thing, we got this order to deliver 5 tonnes, I think it was now, I'm struggling to remember, which really involved stuffing a container full of glucogel and shipping it over to the other side of the world. But before we could actually fulfil that, they did come down and audit the factory. Do we have the quality standards? Did they have confidence in our ability to deliver? And so the head of purchasing from Barilla, Barilla's a 3.7 billion euro per year company, huge company. So their head of purchasing came down, and Marco Caspani, the Italian sales agent for DKSH, came down and visited us. So we showed them the factory. We were fortunate that we had dairy industry people from New Zealand dairy industry people at the technical side of this project who really understood hygiene and food safety and they had very experienced, and that stood us in really good stead on that particular aspect of it. But we were sort of wondering how they come all the way from the other side of the world. We were wondering how they were here for like 2 days. Visiting the factory might be maybe 3 hours. So what were we going to do with these people for 2 days? So we got a little bit creative, and we thought, well, okay, what we'll do is we will introduce them to more of our supply chain. So we'll actually take them out and introduce them to the growers. So we worked with Lucidi Seeds in Rangiora, and we went and visited a couple of the growers. And it was one of the most rewarding sort of experiences I've had in business in some ways, because the head of purchasing of Barilla, I don't think had ever met a grower or been on a cereal farm. But he knew a lot about cereals, he knew a lot about purchasing of them, he was doing it all the time. But the growers had never met a major user of their cereals in that sort of same way. It was almost like a meeting of minds. They were so delighted to see each other. It was a very nice occasion, and then Lucidis had organised to have drinks with some of the growers at one of the growers' houses afterwards, and it was actually quite a heartening thing. And I mention it mainly because when the shit hit the fan later on and things weren't going well, that sort of relationship building aspect, I guess that they liked us. They liked what we were about, what we were trying to do. They believed in us, and that gave us a bit of room to stuff up before we got it right. I don't think you'd have that same latitude if you hadn't built that sort of trust. And it was a chance to build that trust also with the marketing person, Marco. The relationship that ultimately I had with both Marco Caspani, the DKSH sales agent, and the purchasing head of Barilla were really important. One real challenge you've got is when you've got a new product and you've got a distributor that you've appointed, like we thought, wow, we've signed up this great big distributor, is you actually need somebody to do something. You need a person in their organisation to do something. Now, I'd worked with distributors before, and I knew that was one of the keys. So I had some insight, I guess, to the fact that I had to find somebody in DKSH that we would then work really closely with to make successful, and then they become known, and then everyone gets excited. It's sort of the gist of building successful distribution structures. So I didn't really understand at the time why Marco Caspani had spent the time to go out and sell Glucogel and find that initial customer. And I didn't really find out until a later visit, and I dug into that with Marco, and I said, well, I knew you had invested time in it, and I knew that you could have done a whole lot of other things. So why did you do this? And he said, I'd made my quota. I'd been selling soy lecithin to one of my big customers. I'd signed up my sales targets for the year. I was looking for the opportunity for next year. And so he said, I could spend the time. And he said, I thought this had lots of potential. I saw that it had lots of potential. I saw that it was going to be the next. I think it's going to be the next big thing for DKSH as a food ingredient, and we need to get on and make it a success. Marco's background too was that he had started up the DKSH Italian office. So he was quite an entrepreneurial salesperson. So he had not your ordinary ones. There are other ones which are far more transactional. They had good relationships with their clients, but they needed to have the product perfectly described as to who they sell it to, what they sell it for. It needed to be a nice, tidy product. Marco didn't need that same degree of clarity. He could go with a lot more intuition and his own understanding of where it might fit. But I think where we really built perhaps the most strongest relationship with him was when things went wrong with Barilla. And let me briefly describe what that was. We got this order to ship 5 tonnes of product to Barilla. We had a delivery date that we had to be done by, so we full-heartedly threw ourselves into production in the factory and we set about manufacturing 5 tonnes, knowing that it had to be done by a certain date. So we were pushing hard, we were pushing the factory hard, and we were trying to go as fast as we could. As we went along, we were measuring the ingredient, and we were becoming a little anxious about the purity, which was one of the core ingredients or the core components of why this customer would use it, because that was how they would decide how much to formulate into their finished product. So it had to be, 1 gram had to equate to this. You couldn't have to put in 2 or 3. It would change the recipe, it would change the proposition. So we slammed the container door shut and stuck the container on the water, and then the last of the results started to come in for the ingredient, because they were delayed by 2 or 3 days. So the container's gone, it's on the water, and I'm looking at a spectrum of results for the shipments in the container, and it's starting to look like the rings of a tree. You've actually got the tree grew a certain amount in this year, and then the next year it grew a certain amount. The results looked like a bit, the first ones were okay, and then they were starting to slip away. So you could almost say that the back of the container would have met specification, but the front of the container we were quite anxious about. So after a couple of sort of reasonably sleepless nights about what the hell do we do about this, we fessed up. We contacted Marco and we said, we have a problem. And here is what the problem is. We think that a significant component of this container is not going to meet the customer's specification, and we somehow need to manage that. So we suggested to them and to the customer how we might go about doing that, and then the customer, when the container arrived, worked through this 5 tonnes and accepted 750 kilos and rejected 4.25 tonnes of it. So quite apart from being a financial disaster, it was a relationship disaster. I think one of the things that saved us was that Marco did a fantastic job of not just blaming us. He really partnered with us and with the customer and said, right, we know what we've got to do here. How do we achieve it? What have we got to do? And DKSH themselves, with him leading that, were prepared to do whatever it took. And we said, we accept we've made a mistake, we'll do whatever we can to rectify the situation. And in the end, what we ended up doing was we air freighted out samples of new production. So we completely slowed the production system down and changed a whole lot of things and went really painstaking. I think we were polishing each grain of the supplement. And we made another tonne, and we shipped off a sample to Barilla to analyse, and said, if this meets your specification, we'll air freight it to you. And in the meantime, our testing results were not giving me great confidence. But just as I was due to go into a board meeting with the parent board, the ones who were providing all the money, pretty much to say we were buggered. The results came through from Barilla to say the product had met specification and they wanted us to ship the tonne of product. So we got it in the air, it arrived in Italy, the customer incorporated it in the product and did their launch, which was a brilliant flop, but we had a happy customer. So we did actually successfully manage to meet the demanding expectations of Barilla. But I think when you look at it, the relationship we then had with DKSH by them coming over, by ballsing it up, but being totally committed with them to putting it right, that the trust that we built up with each other through being really focused on the customer and actually making it happen, that's built a rapport which has ultimately turned into a real friendship with Marco. He's my friend now, and that's 5 years or 7 years or so ago. With a startup venture like this, which had some unique characteristics, maybe they're not unique, But they are characteristics. One of them was that it was actually the funding that was keeping the venture alive, because this is a loss-making venture, okay? You're making small quantities in an expensive factory that's labour-intensive, so you can't sell it for what it costs. You've got to sell it for what the market will bear. So we were probably, selling, it was probably costing us, I think it was costing us $100 to make per kilo, and we were selling it for 70, okay? So, but, you could see with scale, with volume, with efficiencies, that would be okay. So we've got a reluctant investor. We've got the government putting money into this venture to keep it alive, to reach the point that we can flog it off as quickly as possible to someone who can then spend the money and the capital and make it into a successful venture. But no one's emerging. We're talking to lots of people, but no one's sort of sticking up their hand and saying, we're prepared to get involved. And in fact, even the owner was a reluctant investor. They bled the money in bit by bit. You had to go in cap in hand and say, here's what we're going to do over the next 6 months, here's what it's going to cost, let's do it. And so we had quite a few interesting things. We had people coming in. So I had my own board, GraceLink board, which generally had at least 2 representatives from the Crop and Food Board. And I had a number of changes of board members during that time, people going out because they might have been leaving the Crop and Food Board, people coming in. Each person who came in was going to fix this. This bleeding is going to stop. Because it was a venture that had a multi-million-dollar balance sheet investment on a enterprise, Crop and Food, that maybe was a $50 million a year turnover company. So it was a problem. It's not like it was a great big corporation with a great big balance sheet. This was it was costing them. It was a difficult thing to be involved. What was really interesting, though, was we were going about this very systematically. And everyone who came in who had business skills sat down and said, they came in with I'm going to stop this because, it's going the wrong way and the wrong things are being done. And they sat down and we explained all the things we're doing and we showed them all the criteria that we were trying to run the business against and why we felt it was worth continuing. Every single one of them ended up becoming converts and actually going along and being advocates back into the organisation. It wasn't blind investment of money, but it was a very difficult decision to make as to when you would actually stop it. Because once you stopped it, that investment was sunk, it was dead. And we always had a bit of hope. We had the Barilla sale, which gave us a bit of momentum and showed that we could actually sell to it. It was of interest to a major multinational customer. But we still didn't have that investor. The next stage we did was to find an investor. And we ended up getting a company called Danisco. And I think the most interesting story I can tell about that one was, picture little old me going over to Europe and fronting up to what are large multinational food and ingredients companies and trying to get them interested. So you meet them at these sort of shows and then you try and convince them. So you go along and you pitch to them, the old elevator pitch. So I go to this company called Tate & Lyle in their new R&D centre in Lille in France. And I arrive in this room and there's, I don't know how many people there were, there's 5 or maybe 10 or 15 people in the room. And there's the head of sales and marketing, and there's the head of research and development, and there's a whole lot of senior business managers sitting around, and there's the project guy who was a relatively junior guy who'd introduced me to that. So I stand up and I pitch about glucogel. By that stage, I had actually done this more than once. So it wasn't the raw one, it was perhaps a slightly more refined one, and we could, so you could describe why they should be interested a bit better. It's not something the first few times you do that, you get it wrong and people leave it, and then you start to get it a bit more focused. But what was really amusing about it was I went through the pitch and I said, so we're really looking for an investor and we think that you would be a good partner because you've got a big distribution structure and you do manufacturing, and we think you'd be a really, really good partner. And the head of research and development said to me, she said, this is nonsense. You can't do this. You can't say any of the things that you're saying about this product. Your customers can't do this. This is just crazy. This product is way too immature. It's a long way away from being technically credible, if you like. And then I didn't say I didn't actually even have to address the question because the head of sales and marketing said, "Oh, for goodness sake," he said, "that's nonsense. These guys have sold it to Barilla. They have generated a major sale. They have done this. So what you're saying is all very interesting, but it's not necessarily the only demonstration of value." So what it really came back to was he then said, and what we've got to bear in mind here is, if we wait until this company is a $30 or a $50 million company, we'll then be fighting with all the other companies to try and see. So that was really the proposition that we were trying to take to companies was, you need to reach back a bit further up the risk chain, the value chain, and actually pull these things out when they're a bit more fledgling. Because all of them were really looking for, a $30 or a $50 million company that they could just buy, where the product's proven, you've got initial customers, you've got your manufacturing process refined. So they didn't want the risk of that. And the other side of it, which was described best to me by a venture capitalist, was they said their managers only want to manage a $30 million business because managing that business is the same effort as managing a $1 million or a $2 million investment in a venture. So in the end, we did manage to get a multinational called Danisco to invest in Gracelink, and that was, based on the principles that really came out of that Tate and Lyle experience, and it was quite a process to get them over the line, but it was a really interesting evolution in the capability of the organisation. All of a sudden, we had a distributor alongside us who could actually help us. So we had a technical project and we had a marketing project working with them, and it really just upped the game, upped the level. But trying to find a multinational investor, that was a really fascinating exercise. So one of the really important things about the Gracelink project was we had what I'd call a fatigued or a reluctant investor. We had to find a new capital. We had to find a new investor that enabled the old investor to exit. They didn't want to be part of this for too much longer, and for the business to go on and succeed. So we started a process. We did appoint some advisors. And those advisors really provided mainly they helped us refine the story for a potential investor audience, and they, on our behalf, wrote to a lot of organisations. So we probably canvassed something like 100 food and beverage companies, which we'd done a bit of a research on, that we felt had ingredients businesses that this might be complementary to. So all the big ones. And talked to, I guess then when I was travelling, which I was generally to try and support the distribution structure and make sales, so you sort of had two reasons to be around. I spoke to a number of them, probably 20 or more at trade shows, and pitched Glucogel and the opportunity. Of those, I would have then gone and visited about 6 at their own premise and talked to bigger groups about the opportunity. And they varied from ones which were almost competitors, where you had to be a little bit circumspect particularly about your process and your technologies and your IP protection, to ones where really you could see there was a good complementarity. I mentioned Tate and Lyle was one, but the one that we ended up getting the investment from was Danisco. And I guess to reach the point where Danisco put money into it was quite a process. I first we wrote to them. I saw them at a trade show. The head of technology at Danisco was aware of the Gracelink and the Glucogel technology. He'd seen it or heard of it at a science conference in the dim and distant past. So it wasn't so much on his radar as he wasn't unaware of it. So which probably made him more receptive to hearing the story, and then he became a bit of an advocate to give it a wider hearing in the company, and so we I guess during that sort of formative stage, I probably visited them. I talked to them at a trade conference, visited them maybe 3 times, where we talked in increasing levels of detail under confidentiality agreements. And then we reached a point where they really tabled a terms sheet with us. The other thing that was probably quite important there was we really could see that there was a real wariness about transactions where the company just bought GraceLink, none of them were up for that. They were, because they could see that they needed the existing owner to keep involved. Otherwise, because they were a long way away. That was another big thing. I mean, the fact that a number of them said to me, you know, you're a long way away. In fact, the Barilla people said that to me at one stage too. He said, I love your organisation. I think you're nice people, but you're very small and you're very far away. And we encountered that a lot with the European investors. And the size of the investment was also relatively small. They weren't investing $30 or $50 million, which they would have been more comfortable with. So, you know, in the end, we were sort of really looking for investment levels of maybe $3 to $5 million in the initial phases, with a view that they would have the option to buy out the company when they were ready and shift it into their own manufacturing system. So I think one of the key things about running startup ventures, which is really the big challenging thing, is tenacity. You know, you can have a great product and, you know, prospective markets and, you know, all those sorts of things, but you're going to get lots of no's before you get yeses, and you've got to really just keep the faith that you've got something valuable, and just keep reshaping and keep thinking and find the people who care and really understand why they care, and then reshape the thing to really be a good fit and close the deal and make it happen. You've got to follow through with the make it happen, but you do all those things, you can build businesses of any size and scale.